It is a beautiful day at the Podcast Detroit studios in Midtown. I'm Jer Stays, and this is a conversation edition of Your Daily Detroit for Thursday, May 16th, 2019. Sven is off today, but in studio to join me is RJ King. You may know him as an award-winning journalist and the editor of dBusiness magazine. But he's also the author of a new book about Detroit's history, Detroit, Engine of America. And that's what we're going to talk about today after a word from today's show sponsor. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Milo. Milo is a marketing agency that produces amazing experiences for audiences. They partner with their clients to drive business and create innovative content. Do cool stuff with them at milo.agency. Detroit started off as a frontier town, and the history of the area has always fascinated me. Even our logo at Daily Detroit is a nod to Detroit's history, including references to the French founders, the English, and of course, the United States today. So RJ, Detroit has that long history, and it's a city that's older than the United States, as I understand. It's in a unique group, right?
Correct. It was founded by the French in 1701. So the first chapter of my book covers the time frame of 1600 to 1800, and it talks about the four superpowers of Europe, which were France, Spain, English, and the Dutch, and how the English and the Dutch settled the East Coast. Spanish went down to Florida, West Indies, Cuba, and then the French came up the St. Lawrence and founded Quebec, Montreal, and then Detroit 1701, and then went into Ohio and Kentucky, and that was all called New France, and that was kind of a buffer to keep the English and the Dutch from expanding too far westward.
So we were pretty far on the map back in those days. What drew the attention of superpowers and explorers to come here of all places?
Well, trade routes, first they were looking for silver and gold, which there wasn't a lot of. I mean, you think about how difficult it is to mint a coin. They actually had playing cards that they cut in four pieces and had a stamp of the fleur-de-lis on there for payment to the soldiers. But it was open up these trade routes. In early 1600s, King Louis XIII, he was 13 years old. He donned a beaver pelt hat and created a fashion craze in Europe, and they came over to the New World, especially the French, and started the beaver pelt trade and animal hides, and they were very warm and durable, as we all know, and it was a different era back then. And the ships just kept coming and coming and coming. You know, Cadillac, who founded Detroit with the patronage of Count Pontchartrain, who was the Minister of Trade for France, really saw an opportunity to grow this fort, not into a garrison, but a city, and established this French outpost here, and was so successful that the merchants in Quebec and Montreal were very, very jealous of him because those two merchant groups, Quebec and Montreal, they would trade with the Native Americans. Essentially, Cadillac hired them, and he was undercutting their prices, and so there was a whole battle that went back and forth between them on a competitive level. But that's really what started it, and the first population, the first citizens, or the settlers, if you will, survived on fishing, farming, and hunting with the help of Native American tribes. Some were friendly, some were not. And then 1750s, we got into shipbuilding, and then we got into hearths, which is a small wood-burning stove, but not something you would cook on in the middle of a room with a pipe going up the ceiling. And then we got into building locomotives and thousands and thousands and thousands of rail cars, actual stoves, those elaborate stoves that you would see in the 1800s.
You think about the Garland stove that used to be up at the State Fair. Mm-hmm. That's harking back to that part of our history, right?
Sure. That was the Michigan Stove Company, which was Jefferson and right at the entrance to Belle Isle. And what was going on there was at that time, around 1840, 1850, upstate New York was the stove capital of the world. But when the Erie Canal opened 1825, that got you pretty quickly to the eastern edge of Lake Ontario. And then you would just take a boat all the way to Detroit. And Detroit was really the only place to go in those days that was established. And it had to be self-sufficient because before the canal, it really took a lot of work to get here in terms of portaging land and rivers and lakes. So to this day, I think Detroit is still very, very self-sufficient. We can build anything here. And it goes back to that history of Detroit. 1850s, we got into marine engines really big, and then that just set you up for the automotive industry, which first started in 1896 when Charles Brady King put together the first automobile that he tooled up and down late at night on a weeknight and trailing him on a bicycle was a young Henry Ford, and that was his mentor. So Henry Ford's quadricycle had some of Charles Brady King's parts on it.
And didn't Henry Ford work at a ship dock, I think, on the Detroit River there?
He did. He worked for Detroit Shipping Works, and then he also was an engineer for Detroit at what would be Detroit Edison. But no, he was very well skilled, and he came from a farm that his family owned in Dearborn, and they were quite prosperous, and the parents allowed Henry to tinker around with the farm equipment, and he would fix everything, so that he was doing that at a young age.
One of the themes that I notice here, you talked about a lot of different industries. Reinvention is a thing that Detroit did a lot of in those first 200 years, which is kind of the range of your book, right? Because I understand your book kind of goes from the founding of the city in the 1600s all the way there up to 1900.
Correct.
So do you think that Detroit's kind of kept that reinvention spirit? Are there things we could learn from our past to help us go forward?
Well, I think the one lesson that we learned the hard way was that because we had such demand when the automotive industry hit, and factories too, other factories that were building farm equipment and things, they would put them out into new areas where there weren't residents, but residents would quickly build homes around those plants because they had to walk to work. They didn't have cars and streetcars in those days, and so then when the next plant opened, they kept going further out and further out and further out. Then the auto industry hits, and it keeps going further out. And then Detroit was asked to double its production to be the arsenal of democracy during World War II. So you basically had to double your production. And if you look at why the Take Command plant is based in Warren, it was because there was no more room left. There were no more green fields left in Detroit. Then after the war, half the demand goes away, and you've got all these factories, and people are like, they don't want to live next to an empty factory, especially with children. And so that's when the real estate market took off in the suburbs. It was long before the 67 riots. It started about 1952.
And that's a common misnomer that you see out there. There were a lot of complex factors, some of the things dealing with federal policy, people not wanting to be next to factories. We really had slapdash zoning in those days. And if you go back to some of the houses, and I'm not talking about the stately neighborhoods like Indian Village, but I've been on some cruise with the folks over in John George's folks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was with the cruise with John George's folks over in Old Redford, and going into those stick homes that are literally 600 square feet. And I had been reading that for a good amount of time, people were sleeping in shifts in these places because we didn't build apartment buildings or anything like that. We built all of these little tiny homes that didn't stand the test of time.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look around us in Midtown, all these apartment buildings that have become so popular, those were teeming with people in the 50s and 60s, 1950s, 1960s. And then you see those old historic photos of, thousands of people on the streets of Detroit in the 1800s. Well, the reason for that is because they didn't have anywhere else to go. You did all your shopping there. Unless you were on a farm or something, you pretty much had to be downtown or, in one of those stick homes by a factory.
So let's go back in the time machine to where your book's at. If there was kind of a decade or a year, if you could hop in maybe into the DeLorean of, Back to the Future or something like that and show up anywhere in your book in Detroit's history, where would you land?
Well, I would think the 1880s, 1890s. That's really when the cities really got heavily industrialized, and we could build anything. And lots of great characters at that time frame that were making a name for themselves. R.L. Polk and Ellen Scripps from what was today's the Detroit News. Fred Sanders and Strohs and all those people that we know. They're all highlighted in the book. I think one of the most important and revealing stories through all the research that I did was a gentleman who owned a hotel at State and Woodward by the name of Seymour Finney, called Finney's Hotel. And he would start operating in the early 1840s. Soon after, he was starting to get bounty hunters up, people, slave owners looking for their slaves that were trying to escape through the Underground Railroad. And obviously, we were a major trail in that. At the same time, in Capitol Park, today's Capitol Park, Seymour Finney owned a barn and a tavern. So at the time, for years, he was renting rooms to these bounty hunters, and then he was hiding slaves in that barn. and no one knew what was going on. And the African Americans that he helped escape into Windsor and into Canada, many of them took his last name as a thank you for what he did to support the Underground Railroad.
That is a crazy story and really interesting. So there are a lot of books about Detroit history out there. I've read some parts of it. I think it's really interesting and unique. For you, kind of what drew you to throw your hat into the ring and put this one out there?
Well, there was no book out there that really revealed how the city was built. You know, when did natural gas come in as an energy source, and how did that affect how buildings were built? Same thing with, the telephone, the telegraph, these modern stoves. It just transformed life, and it seemed like every little thing that came in as a positive, the citizenry were just blown away. And during the time frame of the book, starting in 1817, was the first presidential visit, and the town went crazy. They had no pre-notice because there's no real big newspapers or
there's no Twitter.
No, yeah, there's no Twitter. So the call would go out, and people would just consume themselves in entertaining the president and the first lady and the entourage that came, and they typically would stay for 3 or 4 days. And so it was, people like James Monroe, President James Monroe, and some of the others that was just, Detroit loves a party, and they've been doing it a long, long time.
I was reading about the Mardi Gras celebrations, actually. I was doing some research on a project, and one of the things I didn't realize, is that we would actually do Mardi Gras pancakes here. Speaking of partying around here, I'd love to bring back the Mardi Gras pancake.
Yeah, and the first Irish parade, St. Patrick's Day parade, was in 1808, if you can believe it, because the Irish initially came to the East Coast, but they were being persecuted by some of the other religious groups. But France being a Catholic and the Irish largely Catholic, however they could get here, this was like this celebrated frontier town for them. So that was the first wave of immigrants, was the Irish.
Well, RJ, I really appreciate you coming by the studio. How can people get a hold of this book?
Easiest way is momentumbooks.com. We'll also be on Amazon, but Momentum Books is the best way. And then we'll be in area stores, gift shops, gourmet markets, places like that. Anywhere you can buy a magazine or book. Yeah.
Well, folks, be sure to pick yourself up a copy of Detroit Engine of America. RJ King, again, thank you. I really appreciate your time to come by here at the Detroit Shipping Company.
Thank you, Jerry.
A little housekeeping before we let you go. We have another Detroit Public Television segment in production. Be sure to tune into One Detroit on DPTV on Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. to support those who support us. Second, we're getting ready to cover the Mackinac Policy Conference this year. It's going to be a crazy few days on the island, getting interviews and stories with the movers and shakers of Michigan. And no, I do not own any seersucker outfits. You'd think because I'm from the east side, land of no socks in your shoes, but nope, no seersucker at all. With that, it's the end of the week for the Daily Detroit podcast. Thanks to the team who lends their talents behind the scenes in big ways and small ways. Randy Walker, Cheyenne Noserini, Sven Gustafson, Nuri Gojai, who I'm sad to say is moving away in a few weeks. We will be ever grateful for your help to get this bird flying. Of course, Bob and Dave at Podcast Detroit, Billy over at Milo, Ryan at Repurpose, and of course, the most important part of our team, you. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.